We're continuing our study of the Seminar of Jacques Lacan, Book 1, Freud's Papers on Technique, 1953 to 1954. Chapter 18 is titled The Symbolic Order. It's long and rambling. It's quite confusing, in fact, but there are a number of things that become clearer in the course of the lesson about what Lacan's psychoanalytic project is and what his framework is. The lesson begins with a criticism of what Lacan calls the dyadic relationship posed by psychoanalyst Alice Balint. According to Lacan, Balint's dyadic construction of how a person as subject relates to another as object exists entirely in the imaginary register and does not get at the heart of the analytic matter. Remember that for Lacan, there are three registers involving the human subject and his or her environment. There is the register of the imaginary, which is how a person ordinarily senses the world. But on top of this is the register of the symbolic, the kind of rule-based interpretative frameworks that get laid over the world of the senses to give them an extra social significance. The world at this symbolic level is not only the things in my immediate environment, but the way things appear for me and are connected up to my larger projects and desires, including those projects and desires that other people have for me and which I have internalized. There is also one more register for Lacan, in addition to the imaginary and symbolic, and this is the register of the real. The real is that which cannot be symbolized, but which nevertheless exist. Put crudely, and in a rather silly way, the real is what the moon does when nobody's looking. It's the way things are outside of being sensed, or conceptualized, or symbolized. Part of Lacan's project is connection with this real. But we can never have direct access to the real. We can only ever have access to the real to the extent that we try to represent it at the level of the symbolic. We have to learn to render the unconscious wants into words. For an ordinary, psychologically healthy person, this is for the most part done. The ordinary healthy subject has found a way to render what he or she wants into a language that's intelligible for himself or herself, and that exists apart from what anyone else in the world would want for him or her. Even the ordinary, psychologically healthy person cannot do this at all times, of course, just as the ordinary healthy person is not physically fit at all times. But rendering the real into the symbolic is nonetheless the goal or paradigm for what constitutes ordinary psychological healthiness. In this chapter, Lacan admittedly puts all this rather enigmatically. Here is one such statement. He says on page 228, quote, "Truth hollows out its way into the real thanks to the dimension of speech. There is neither true nor false prior to speech. Truth is introduced along with it, and so is the lie, in other registers as well." End quote. What Lacan is trying to say here, albeit rather cryptically, is that at the psychological level, a person's speech has the power to give voice to what is at the very real core of that person. Through a person's speech, truth is delivered. And Lacan says that speech also has the power to mask the truth or to even be ambiguous. He says on page 229, quote, "Speech is in its essence ambiguous," end quote. The therapeutic process is trying to break through that ambiguity to the truth at the level of the real. Lacan says on page 232, quote, "It is the act of speech which is constitutive or constitutive of giving voice to the real." He goes on, "The process of an analysis does not consist in the enlarging of the field of the ego. It is not the reconquest by the ego of its margin of the unknown. Rather, it is a genuine inversion, a displacement, whereby the person's unconscious, the unconscious wants and desires, are given voice to instead of the ego." To give poetic voice to what Lacan is after, Lacan quotes the German priest, I believe it's pronounced Angelus Silesius, and this priest's poem, The Cherubic Wanderer. The lines are on page 232, and they go like this. Man become essential, for when the world fails at last, the contingent falls away, but essence that stands fast. The goal is to get beyond all the inauthentic impositions at the level of the symbolic world, so we can get to the very core of what is real for the person. And that level of reality is what is to be rendered into the symbolic to emerge into the symbolic world. Lacan says also on page 232, that really is what's at issue at the end of analysis, a twilight, an imaginary decline of the world, and even an experience at the limit of depersonalization. He says in italics, that is when the contingent falls away, the accidental, the trauma, the hitches of history, and it is being which then comes to be constituted. End quote. Let's stop there. Thank you for listening.